Welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, October 20th, 2025, and in just 15 days, we will have an election in the state of New Jersey that'll take place, to which the residents in this state will elect their next governor for a 4-year term. Today, we're going to be talking about an onslaught of polls we've been seeing over the past few weeks, as the narrative has been in the state of New Jersey that this race is becoming increasingly more and more narrow as the Democrats and Republicans barrel into the final 2 weeks of this gubernatorial race the Republicans have been cautiously optimistic about for the 2025 cycle. Now, the impetus for this video actually was 2 weeks ago. I made a video talking about how Democrats really needed to wake up about the New Jersey governor's race, that this was not a race that they could afford to squander, especially given that this and Virginia, alongside Proposition 50 in California, will stand in, and of course, in part, the New York City mayoral election, but I think we're pretty much all wrapped there knowing Mamdani is going to be the next mayor of New York City. Getting back to this point, though, New Jersey stands to be a state that could really show displeasure with the President of the United States and substantive pushback against this second Trump administration and what Republicans are doing across the country. Now, on your screen right now is a website called ballotline.com. This is obviously not sponsored, but the reason why I'm pointing it out is because this is my first time actually using it on video. It's a brand new website here. Wonderful, by the way. I got onto it for the first time today to look at the New Jersey governor race polls, and then I came across their actual website here. Phenomenal work on this website. So, highly recommend. In the absence of 538, it's actually been quite sad not to see, a substantive area to look at polls besides Real Clear Politics, which has its own problems with partisan skewing of the polls, but it stands in really as one of the only resources available. I appreciate this a lot. Highly recommend that you check it out. But looking at the data on some of these New Jersey polls, the point of this video isn't necessarily that Democrats are going to win New Jersey. I think they will win New Jersey. I think that's been a constant. I do think that there was a time where it seemed closer and closer that there might be a shock upset for Chattarelli, which there might still be to some degree, but it's a lot less expected than I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago. And I think a lot of this comes down to some of the data points we're seeing showing Chattarelli not really in a great position in this state relative to what the expectations are. The most recent poll that we saw, tabulated here and just across the board in the state of New Jersey is a Republican internal pollster, Change New Jersey. It's a firm that is focused on electing a Republican for governor in the state. Just did a survey with KA Consulting showing Jack Chattarelli at 44% and Mikey Sherrill at 47%. Now, the most recent nonpartisan poll comes from Fairleigh Dickinson University. They show Sherrill ahead by a 7-point margin, and so that's roughly what we're tracking to expect in the state of New Jersey. But what I've noticed isn't as much of a Sherrill victory. I think, again, that's been what I've been maintaining. Rather, it is the numbers that Chattarelli seems to be constantly at and finds himself at this consistent ceiling across the state of New Jersey. What we find here is that in the most recent survey, even the Republican internal, which arguably should be giving Republicans, more bang for their buck, and arguably in a more competitive position, because internals only really are released at this stage in the campaign to encourage last-minute funneling of money into a race to try to make it so that if there was a race within the margin of 10, 20,000 votes, a few $1 million really can change the dynamics of a race in the final stages, especially given that New Jersey, not a relatively small state, but still is on the smaller side, and a lot of money can go a long way in this state. The Republicans would stand to gain tremendously by having this race more competitive. And even with, I'm sure what is skewed questioning and a skewed sample, the best results they can find is that Mikey Sherrill still ends up winning in this race, and Jack Chattarelli ends up losing with 44% of the vote. But that number is a constant. 44, 45, 44, 45, 44, 44, 43, 42, 46. The best number comes from Qantas Insights nearly a month ago, showing him at 46%. And might I remind the Republican Party that Mikey Sherrill leading means she has a higher number than the Republicans do. And in order to be in this competitive territory where the margin of error needs to be, even more significant to see the victory, he needs to still be within that range that he's getting near 50%. Right, what we remember vividly, I think, from the last presidential cycle was that, sure, absolutely, right, the national electorate said it was a more competitive race, that, Kamala Harris might be in a position where she could win a state like Wisconsin, but she was tracking to lose Pennsylvania, all of these different things. The polling data, though, roughly had them 48-49, 49-49, 50-50, right, very close races, and both of the candidates were nearing the exact percentages that they got in the final stretch of the election and on Election Day. But what we're finding is that Ciattarelli is reaching that ceiling, the same ceiling that Donald Trump received in the 2024 election, which was 46% of the vote. It's not a great place to be, because the Republican internals should be saying that this race is far more competitive. The Republican internals should be saying that Ciattarelli is within striking distance, not within 4 points, given that there is just 2 weeks to go. Because not much is going to change between the two candidates in the final stage of this election. It is going to be a closer than, necessary race for the Democratic Party, but it's not one where they're slow walking into defeat. I think that it felt like over the summer that this race, as it got more nationalized attention and more of an interesting dynamic after the primaries, and of course, just generally speaking, what we were tracking for an already competitive and expensive general election, that this race has put Democrats largely on edge, but they probably don't need to be. The emphasis on the word need there. I think that Kamala Harris, having won this state by 6 points in the last election, even in 2021, when Biden was unpopular, although we did see that Phil Murphy underperformed what the data was saying, at the end of the day, he still ended up winning. And even if you string this along, right, 7.8 down to 2.8, that's a 5-point shift. Mikey Sherrill, would be in dangerous territory then. But that's assuming that you're within that, and even with a universal shift, which I do adamantly believe that the data that we saw back in 2021 is substantively different than the data that we see in 2025, even the 2024 election. I think this is a great example of how I think that the polls, to some degree at least, have improved. In 2020, right, Biden was leading in all of the states. But on Election Day, it was Trump who led in the majority, except for 2 states. He led in Arizona by 3, he won by 5. Led in Nevada by 1, he won by 2. Led in Michigan by 1, he won by 2. Led in Pennsylvania was losing in Michigan, won by 2. Leading in Pennsylvania, 1. Leading in North Carolina, 1. Leading in Georgia, 1. It was Wisconsin and Michigan that there were only 2 states, contrary to what I think national perception was, that Harris was leading in all of these states. Yes, for a while she was. But in those final 2 weeks really, was what did in the campaign, and that's what ultimately we saw. The data changed. But I do believe that we are in a different day and age in polling than we were in 2020, and I do think even to an extent 2021, and even to that point here, the Republican pollsters still can't find him within victory. I think if we were really tracking for, Mikey Sherrill to lose this race, she would not be doing, up in every single poll. There would have been one that broke through. Even Trafalgar, which is historically, notorious for having skewed results in 2022 in favor of the GOP. They said Washington Senate race would be Democrat plus 3. Guess what it was? Democrat plus 15. They said that Pennsylvania's Senate race would go to Dr. Oz, then it went to Fetterman by 5. They said Georgia and Arizona were going red in 2022, and they went blue. And in 2025, this is Quinnipiac University, but if you take a look at the data from, we can even find it here on the New York Times, Trafalgar and Insider Advantage, even they say Mikey Sherrill was ahead. And even they cannot find Jack Ciattarelli over the number he needs, 45% of the vote, to even match what the President of the United States got in 2024. And I think that is a huge fundamental difference between the two, which is that, Trump peaked out at this point. Ciattarelli might not even reach that. And I think we forget also, I think this is something that is going to be on the top of minds of voters in New Jersey. Yes, I do think there will be some Kamala Harris voters that do not vote in 2025 or do vote for Jack Ciattarelli because maybe they want something different for their state. But I simultaneously believe there's going to be depreciated Donald Trump voter turnout. I also think, too, that based on the approval rating that we know the president has in the state, we can find down here, if we zoom in, he's going to have an approval rating of -20 across the state. On the national stage, he's not doing well either. So if the national environment, which elected him by 1.5%, is suddenly souring on him by 8, 9, 10%, can you only imagine a state that voted against him in the last cycle? There's no compelling reason, seriously, to believe that Ciattarelli is in this position where he is the favorite to win. Now, this isn't to say that he can't. I started off this video by saying that there's always a chance of an upset, especially in a race like this. In Virginia, it's a foregone conclusion that Abigail Spanberger is going to be the next governor. Very likely that Ghazala Hashmi ends up being the lieutenant governor, and a very real chance that Jay Jones ends up being elected attorney general, even amidst, a very, very, very scandal-plagued campaign. But in New Jersey, it's not as locked in as the Virginia governor's race. But it certainly is, to some degree at least, an expectation that Democrats win this race, because the data says that they will. We will see. Democrats absolutely still need to turn out and vote. They still need to really bring home an election victory here, because at the end of the day, too, what New Jersey will serve to be as is part of this potential, and then that's why I say potential, too, because there's no guarantee that happens either, referendum on the president of the United States, that maybe New Jersey could stand to be one of those states where such a massive shift is happening across the states that it finds itself being national newsworthy. That, Mikey Sherrill trounces Republican in New Jersey after an expected competitive race, which could also be quite insightful in us understanding, okay, well, there's a lot of hype around this race. There's a lot of polling data saying this race is going to be competitive. Everyone's focused on it. Virginia is out of question. Yes, they're focusing on attorney general because they can't focus on governor. They can't focus on a lieutenant governor. But in New Jersey, this is their, number one race. This is their major statewide race here. But if Democrats do, in fact, outperform the expectations, it will stand in contrast with what historical precedent has said and simultaneously be a national news story in and of itself. Because Mikey Sherrill, as we've seen from the doom and gloom and the fear that has come across the eyes of Democrats in this country, in specific in New Jersey over the past few weeks, it could really stand to be quite a moment for the National Democratic Party if, in fact, and this is a big if in fact they do outperform to the degree that they'd like to. New Jersey will be fascinating. I think this is going to be potentially our closest race, save maybe the Attorney General's race. I think it'll be closer than Virginia Lieutenant Governor and Virginia House of Delegates popular vote, and also the governor's race, of course. The governor's race in New Jersey is one that I do think could be more narrow. However, Mikey Sherrill is still on track for victory. This is, only would have been the case if it was a Youngkin type of situation where around this point in Virginia of 2021, we can actually take a look at the data. It was around this point that Glenn Youngkin started taking that lead. You can't see here. If anyone also knows how to fix this on the screen, for some reason, I think I have an ad block or something enabled, but I've turned them all off and it doesn't work. But the trend lines here don't work. They work on incognito. I really don't know what it is. But in any case, we can just visually see here that it was around this point that McAuliffe's lead went from, the beginning of October, which was, a 5-point advantage to the end of September. Or let's go to October 1st, up until around this point, October 20th, was leading by just 1.5 points, and then a week later was leading by less, and then a week later, it was Youngkin winning on Election Day and leading on Election Day by roughly 1.7%. We aren't really seeing that trend line for Mikey Sherrill. Yes, it is getting closer, as it inevitably was going to be, but it is not getting to the point of a Republican victory, and we have to remember, this is a Donald Trump midterm. He's unpopular in this state. He lost the state in the last election, and as much as Republicans would like this to be a 2021 redux with just slightly more of an improvement, my chances are that I believe the Democrats will win the governor's race in New Jersey potentially by a similar margin to 2021, if not slightly better. And while that may just be, maybe we're misreading the data, maybe that we'll see a sudden spike and surge in Trump's base, in Republican base, which I don't think we're going to see, but, just toying with the idea of it, maybe that could be the case. But honestly speaking, being very honest about where we are and where we stand in the state of New Jersey, looking at it from the polling perspective, looking at it from the data, from the Republicans, the Democrats, whoever it is, even the Republicans just simply cannot find a way to make Jack Ciattarelli Indian victory point. They cannot find a way to show him above 44% of the vote in the state, and I think that is what is going to do him in. He's reaching the point Trump did, but as Trump can tell you in the state of New Jersey, that simply is not enough. And thinking about 2025, given that Trump is down 20 points in the state, given that Trump is down nationally by 10, given that he was down the state in 6, in the last cycle, lost it by 16 to Biden, lost it by 15 to Clinton. Republicans haven't won New Jersey, I think, since 1988. I want to be right about this, so we're going to go ahead and check. I believe since 1988 was the last time that Republicans won the state of New Jersey, and that was George H.W. Bush against Michael Dukakis. Since then, it has been a state that Democrats have been able to rely on, even in the last cycle, as it got closer. They still won it by a likely margin, as they will likely do again in 2025 with Mikey Sherrill at the top of the ticket. We'll see what happens here. Interesting race, but the Republicans, even their pollsters, cannot skew the margins enough to find the Republicans winning in New Jersey, which probably means the Democrats are the ones who will come ahead in a race that is far more competitive than I think Democrats would have hoped, but a race they will likely win nonetheless. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2025 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.